I'm Sahil Rahman. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, a rural revolt. Farmers around the world are marching in protest against economic and climate policies. So, why is it proving so difficult to boost their incomes? Also this week, the farming sector is one of the main drivers of economic growth in Mexico. We speak to the nation's Secretary of Agriculture and Rural Development. Plus, prices are easing in many parts of the world. So is the fight against inflation turning the corner? And will central banks cut interest rates soon? Welcome. They came in convoys of tractors loaded with fruits and vegetables. Thousands of farmers around the world left their fields and took to the streets in recent weeks. From Italy to India, their grievances vary by country. But there's one common concern. Farmers say they can't make ends meet. They're blaming red tape, climate change policies, cheap imports at high costs, and they're putting pressure on their respective governments to improve their livelihoods. Axel Ziamovich reports.
Farmers across Europe are protesting, demanding better prices for their produce and restrictions on cheaper imported goods.
The first thing the government has to do is eliminate the bureaucracy, give us facilities and control foreign products so they have the same health conditions as those from here.
The unrest began in Germany after cuts to agricultural diesel subsidies, impacting a sector employing under 1 million people. Similar demonstrations in Spain, Poland, and France call for improved living conditions and protection against unfair competition. Despite the allocation of up to $240 billion for supporting farmers, many say existing regulations don't benefit growers. They also criticize the EU's environmental regulations and the bloc's Common Agriculture Policy, or CAP, for favoring large corporations.
This CAP that we have now has so many bureaucratic steps that we cannot manage to comply. We need an agricultural policy that truly adapts to the farmers' needs and allows for profitability.
Protests extend beyond Europe, with farmers in India, the US, and Brazil expressing grievances over issues like debt, price volatility, and climate change impacts.
If the government fulfills our demands, we will go home. We have no intention of living here on the road. We've been living, eating, and sleeping on the road. You know that it's not easy to get out of our homes, especially for women.
Lawmakers have attempted to address farmers' concerns by offering concessions, but they have been deemed insufficient. Many say financial aid alone and complex regulations fail to address the deeper challenges faced by farmers. Axel Ziamovich, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, joining us from Copenhagen in Denmark is Alan Matthews. He's a professor of European agricultural policy in the Department of Economics at Trinity College in Dublin. Mr. Matthews, welcome to Counting the Cost. I mean, farmers across Europe have historically been unhappy with legislation that impacts on their ability to produce enough for them to make a decent living. Why is there so much discontent across certainly the European continent right now?
As your report highlighted, very often the spark of these protests in different countries is quite different, but there is this common theme of dissatisfaction with low prices and low incomes. To some extent, that's not a new issue. I think what has added perhaps to the protests on this occasion is this growing sense of insecurity and vulnerability because of the very variable weather conditions we've also experienced in Europe. So this great feeling of insecurity, will there be a harvest at the end of the season or not? I think that is also driving some of the fears behind the farmer protests.
We'll certainly talk about climate change in a moment. Can I just talk about the politics of it to start with? Because, for example, the UK election is pending in 2024, as are EU elections in June later this year. Farmers seem to be getting better organised in making their protests loud and visible. How important are they in terms of organising, and are they getting quite savvy about it?
I think you're right to highlight the fact that this is an election year in many, obviously for the European Parliament, in a number of individual European countries, but also in other countries, in India, for example, later this year. So clearly, if you have a grievance, now is the time to raise your voice, because you have the opportunity to influence the composition of the incoming Parliament and potentially government. So I do think the fact that there are elections is an issue behind the convergence of protests in many different countries.
Do you think it also runs a little bit deeper? Because without farmers, you and I and billions of others around the world don't eat. Is there a trust deficit right now between farmers and legislators?
Well, I think the protests themselves demonstrate that, but it's hard to sometimes see the rationale for the protests if you actually look at the figures. For example, in Europe, the last 2 to 3 years have actually been years of record high incomes for farmers, despite the impact of the Russian invasion in Ukraine and high energy prices, high fertilizer prices. Actually, producer prices increased even more. Now, that's not to say that farmers looking ahead are not facing into a period of falling prices and higher costs. But just at this point in time, actually incomes, at least in Europe, have been quite buoyant. So you then look at some of the other issues that have been raised, the environmental conditions that are sometimes attached to payments and the increased regulation arising from, the very serious environmental challenges which we've become increasingly aware of in Europe. So it's not just income, it is, as you highlighted in your report, also to do with the regulatory environment in which farmers must operate.
Some governments are saying that they are making concessions to make the livelihoods of farmers more amenable, yet there are policies that are put in place and constantly blamed by farmers who then adapt. It feels like both sides are moving their own set of goalposts, but those goalposts aren't aligned.
What we have seen in response to the protests is some rollback of some of the environmental conditions which, at least in Europe, have recently been introduced. We've just had a reform of that common agricultural policy that you mentioned in your report, and that is just being introduced, in fact, earlier last year. So we're now in the second year of this reform period. But already a number of the innovations, a number of the changes that farmers were asked to adopt have been rolled back as a response to the protest. Some of the regulatory initiatives which the European Commission had proposed to address, for example, the use of pesticides in agriculture, to set aside an increased area of land for nature, to ensure that we restore some of the biodiversity which we are losing. These measures have also been either withdrawn or watered down. So there indeed has been a response on the regulatory side. I would say that in Europe, a particular problem is that the Common Agricultural Policy is funded from the European budget. And the European budget is very restricted in its ability to increase those transfers. The budget is set on a relatively long period for 7 years, and it's actually rather inflexible. So the possibility to address some of the farmers' concerns by increasing the transfers, which are already quite significant, of course, is very limited at the present time. So this is why I think we see the focus being put on rolling back some of these environmental regulations in an attempt to show that governments are aware of the concerns that are being expressed.
Alan Matthews from Trinity College in Dublin, joining us from Copenhagen. Thanks so much for your time, sir. So, from avocados, known as green gold in Mexico, to coffee. The Latin American nation is amongst the world's leading producers and exporters of food products. Much of its produce goes to the United States. The agriculture sector is one of its main drivers of economic growth. But farmers face a range of challenges, amongst them falling grain prices and threats from drug cartels. I spoke to the Secretary of Agriculture, Victor Villalobos Arambula, during his visit to Doha and started by asking him how his government is tackling these concerns.
Well, let me mention, you raised an issue related in Culiacan. Well, Sinaloa is the most important state through which they produce, I would say, the highest proportion of the corn, which is the staple food for Mexicans, and so it's very important state. So they protest because of the price of corn, and of course they want to receive more support from Mexican federal government. So what we do, we provide assistance to the farmers, particularly the small farmers, which is part of our policy, how we can enhance productivity at the same time that we raise the standard of living, particularly the peasants and the small farmers.
And of course, you know, it's not just crop price that's their problem in a place like Sinaloa in the state. Extortion, gangs, drug cartels are also another problem that they face in their day-to-day lives in trying to earn a living and trying to get through life itself.
Yeah, well, that's part of the information that is being public, and yes, we have some problems in security, in particular with the farmers, and when they are trying to sell their products. But in general terms, it's located in some regions, particularly you mentioned Sinaloa, yes. But in general terms, agriculture is growing, the production is increasing. The role that Mexico plays, not just only to sustain the food security of Mexican society, but also we export products to 191 countries, products for agriculture. So it is an spot, it is an information that is localized, but this is not affecting the general agriculture production.
I mean, you do export, as you say, but you also import as well. And there's a big debate going on with one of your largest trading partners to the north, and that's the US. And it's all over genetically modified seed. And in this particular case, corn. Where is that conversation right now with the US?
We are self-sufficient for white corn for human consumption. We rely very much on the importation of yellow corn. But yellow corn in the United States is genetically modified. And last year, with the discussion, internal discussion, because we have to think in terms of Mexico as a center of origin of corn and center of genetic diversification. So there is a lot of social interest to keep Mexican corn free of genetic modified organisms, particularly corn. So we import, and we will continue importing because it's no longer an issue. It is something that will continue.
It's an important part of that import-export scenario.
The concern is that there is no permission to import white corn for human consumption. But since Mexico is self-sufficient, so this is not an issue. Still, there is a panel in which we anticipate that is going to be solved there.
Let's talk about import and export, because there was the North American Free Trade Agreement, originated in 1994. It was replaced under President Trump in the 2018 USMCA with you and Canada involved. How is that going?
Well, it's going very well. Let me just mention that, particularly in agriculture, now we are the first provider of food to the United States in terms of horticulture crops, fruit crops, cattle, meat. So we enjoy it, and it is beneficiated very much our agro industry. And we are somehow gradually integrated a North American market in which Canada, United States, and Mexico are integrated in the order to guarantee food production for North American countries, but also it's very interesting to say that we are gradually playing more and more important role as a food provider for the rest of the world. Yes.
You are a minister. you are part of the Mexican government that obviously sees what's going on around the world. And you won't be blind to what's going on in Europe right now. Farmers are on the streets, whether it be in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, complaining about the price they're getting for their products.
Yes.
As you head, and the government heads in Mexico to a presidential election later this year,
Yes.
how important is it to understand the problems of farmers in Mexico? Because, as I said at the beginning of this interview, they are a huge vote bank, and a vote bank that Mexican politicians cannot ignore.
Yes, well, that's a good point. Well, since as a Secretary of Agriculture of Mexico, of course, we work very close with the agriculture farmers in Mexico, and we don't anticipate any problem as long as we can guarantee adequate prices. We can continue providing assistance. We can help them with our different services that we have already in place. And that's something that even in the new administration that eventually will take over the 1st of October, we don't anticipate any problems. So we will continue in the way that we have been doing. And as I would like to say that nowadays Mexico is enjoying a very important position worldwide as a food provider. We are the 12th country that produce food, and as I mentioned, we guarantee self-sufficiency for Mexican society, but also we are enjoying the exportation of many agricultural products. So I don't see any problem with the new administration. We'll continue the same path.
We shall see what happens.
Yes.
Minister Victor Arambula from Mexico. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
From near zero to a 23-year high, the US Federal Reserve has raised interest rates at their most rapid pace in more than 4 decades to tame inflation. And for more than 2 years, central banks around the world have done the same. But prices are now easing in most major economies. Investors and buyers are asking when central banks might start to reduce those rates. We'll get to that with our guest shortly. But first, how do interest rates work and why do they matter? Well, when central banks increase interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive. People start to save more and spend less, and demand for goods goes down, eventually causing prices to drop. But that hurts borrowers as credit, like credit loans, car loans, mortgages, and credit cards become costlier. For example, credit card rates in the US are at an all-time high, with Americans owing more than $1 trillion. High interest rates also worry governments because they slow economies. Central banks have been treading a very fine line between raising rates and not pushing their nations into a recession. Like many other central banks, the US Federal Reserve is aiming to keep inflation at 2%. Consumer prices fell sharply from their peak of 9.1% in 2022, but are still above that target. Now, inflation has slowed. Federal officials have kept rates steady at between 5.25% and 5.5% since July. The European Central Bank interest rate hit records of 4% in September and hasn't been changed since then. The Bank of England also held rates at 5.2%. So, when will central banks start cutting rates? To discuss that, well, I'm joined now from London by Greg Swenson. He's a founding partner at the merchant bank Brigg Macadam.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you with us. Greg, it's a difficult one, isn't it, for 2024? One wonders, as I'm sure millions of others do around the world, when interest rates are going to fall, if they fall at all.
It's a really difficult challenge for these central banks because the inflation, while it's come down, the rate of inflation has come down significantly. Inflation is sticky and it's still above the targets in most places. And so they have a real challenge here. They've made mistakes, significant mistakes in the last few years by waiting too long to raise rates. So they have a bunch of challenges. The market right now looks like it's indicating that the European Central Bank will cut rates in June, as well as the Fed in the US in June, and the Bank of England a little later. The market's indicating that they'll cut in August. So I think that's too late. I think they're being too cautious. Again, they were stung by the mistakes of 2021. So now they're being really, they're really afraid to raise rates, to cut rates too quickly for fear of increasing inflation again.
Okay, well, can I just jump in there? Greg, can I just jump in there? Because if governments are spinning that line that, hey, we're fighting inflation and we're winning it, and you're, as you've said, banks are being very cautious about that inflation rate and are very reluctant to declare victory. What are the signs we're looking for from the banks, at least, or the words, the statements that we need to keep an eye on to realise that maybe inflation is being beaten at last?
Well, I think, obviously, if they see prints below, at or below 2%, you saw that in Switzerland, it came in at 1.3%. And so you'll see the Swiss National Bank probably cut rates in March. So that's what they're looking for. But I think that's, in many ways, they're ignoring some obvious challenges, which is basically anemic economic growth. So I think at some point they should pay less attention to inflation and think about economic growth. You're seeing really anemic growth in Europe. You saw a decent economic growth in the US in the fourth quarter and most of last year, but most of that was due to government spending, which is inflationary by nature. So, government spending is really a problem. It created a sugar high in GDP growth, but you've got this bad combination of artificial GDP growth in the US as well as other places due to government spending, which is unsustainable. And then you've got this real regulatory burden, some of which, you mentioned in the segment about agriculture, but that's one of the real challenges is the supply side, is the government hostility to the private sector is making whatever the central banks do somewhat irrelevant. And so I think that the central banks will have little choice but to cut rates because they're facing economic stagnation.
Okay. If that is the case, if that is the case, I mean, none of this works in isolation, does it, Greg, really? Because we've got to also look at geopolitics. The banks can say whatever they want, the governments can say whatever they want, but we've got two major conflicts going on right now. War in Ukraine, and we've got the war on Gaza. And in terms of the war on Gaza, we've seen how trade routes have had to veer away from the Red Sea and go round the continent of Africa. This all impacts on those long-term decisions about inflation, about investment, and about reducing rates.
No, it's a great point. And I think we were all concerned about the inflationary possibilities coming out of the Red Sea, and that has actually turned out to be okay. So, perhaps we have to wait a little longer to see if that's consistent. But so far, that hasn't really had a ripple effect on supply chains enough to create more inflation. But I think these governments are going to have to reduce the regulatory burden. The business investment in the U.S. was very weak, and I think that's due to a lot of regulatory burden. So expectations in the U.S. for 2024 are 1.4% GDP growth and 1.8 in 2025. That's pretty anemic. So that, I think, gives the Fed some room to run and lower rates.
OK, Greg, just finally, and a very quick question, really, I suppose, really, for our consumers that are watching. I'm sure there are many millions of them around the world. It's all about gas prices. In various countries, certainly in the UK, gas prices are about to be reduced come the spring. How are we supposed to read and analyse this with this ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into that. Part of the problem in the UK is they have price caps, they have subsidies, and when you have both of those things, it ends up being inflationary by nature. So if gas prices, yes, are coming down, I think that gives the central banks a little more leeway to cut. But electricity prices in the UK are still up 400% or more over the last few years. Housing's up 250%, childcare up 200%. These are all sectors with excess government regulation and excess subsidies. So when you regulate and when you subsidize, prices go up. So I think it's going to require a lot more than the central banks dovish or the central banks easing on interest rates.
Well, we'll have to see what does happen. For the moment, Greg Swenson there from Brigg Macadam joining us from London. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Now, the world's largest cryptocurrency by market value, Bitcoin, has reached more than $60,000 last week for the first time in more than 2 years. That helped lift the combined value of the cryptocurrency market to around $2 trillion. The The digital currency has risen around 28% since the start of the year. The surge comes after the US approved the first Bitcoin spot exchange traded fund. ETF allows investors to gain exposure to the price movements of the digital coin without directly owning it. Well, Qatar's sovereign wealth fund is making a $1 billion leap into the heart of innovation. The investment was announced at one of the world's largest tech conferences, the Web Summit, being held here in Doha. It aims to attract the brightest minds in venture capital and entrepreneurship to the Gulf. The commitment to startups builds on Qatar's plans to become a major technology hub in the region. A venture capital fund collects money from various investors to infuse capital in startups with high growth potential. It's managed by a general partner who selects promising companies based on innovation and leadership. And after initial investing, the fund also supports these companies in achieving successful financial outcomes. Qatar says the scheme focuses on sectors like financial and educational technology, as well as healthcare. The event, held for the first time in the Middle East, attracted the largest gathering of international startups. Artificial intelligence took centre stage at this year's gathering. Industry leaders discussed the importance of ongoing investment in the technology. From the challenges and opportunities facing AI, the conversation also turned to its role in driving sustainable development.
Large language models or generative AI is not everything about AI. There's many other parts and facets of AI, from machine learning to language processing to even graph theory, right, and sort of reasoning engines. And so what you're going to start to see now is everything is going to start becoming multimodal, so they work together. So it's multidisciplinary, multiple technologies. And that's going to be the big trend if I think about sort of 24 and beyond. And that's going to allow us to evolve what this stuff can do.
More inclusive access to space also took the spotlight. Digital infrastructure is poised to drive global trends and transform our lives.
Where we're going tomorrow is really about the things that we can actually do with infrastructure in space. So taking that straight to the extreme, this is things like solar farms in space that can provide clean energy to planet Earth. So other renewable energy sources at the moment, solar, is only available half the day because the sun goes in at night time, and wind doesn't blow all of the time. So these sustainable resources, you can't rely on them. Whereas in space, the sun is shining all of the time, and if we can harness a way to bring energy back to Earth that we can use, then that is really going to address many of the problems that we face on Earth.
And that's our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm at @so_Rahman, and do use the hashtag @AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sahil Rahman, and from the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news is next on Al Jazeera.